Well, hey folks, welcome to Profiling Evil, where we unravel the twisted tales of history's most fascinating crimes and the people behind them. Today, we're diving into one of the most infamous chapters of the Old West, the crimes and chaos along the Transcontinental Railroad. I'm here in Union Station in Ogden, Utah, the hub of all things trains in the United States. In this episode, we'll explore over 100 miles of northern Utah, a lawless stretch of ground where murder, robbery, and mayhem became part of the rail's gritty legacy. From daring heists to bloody betrayals, the stories you're going to hear are as wild as the land itself. So buckle up, folks, and join me as we uncover the dark underbelly of this historic route in the latest addition to our Twisted Tales playlist. In the early part of 1869, over 8,000 workers, mostly Chinese, were racing their way from San Francisco, California toward Promontory Summit, which is clear over there. And it's about an hour east of where we are if we were driving quickly from here in Lucin, Utah. From here in Lucin, the race really got going. The Central Pacific Railroad had just completed 2 years of blasting through the solid granite rock in the Sierra Nevada mountains in Nevada here to the west of me. It would take almost a full year for the railroad to build a track across the Nevada landscape, and now they were nearing the finish line, where the golden spike would be pounded into place as the east line and the west line met. Now, on the eastern side of the country, the Union Pacific Railroad was nearing the southwest corner of Wyoming and entering northeastern Utah. Both railroads were planning on reaching a predetermined spot in Utah sometime in the late spring of 1869. The Union Pacific Railroad proudly reported that they were averaging about 3 miles of new track each day. Now remember, they're doing all this by hand, blasting it, grading it, and laying that heavy rail. It was now March 1869, and the excitement was high. On the other side, the Central Pacific Railroad crews had just completed that major route through the Nevadas and a train station here in Lucin, again, where Dylan Rounds was murdered. And the Union Pacific established stations along the route. These developments included bunkhouses, section stations, and support facilities for trains. Since the trains were steam-driven, water storage was a high priority. In some cases, crews would build water lines to carry water from natural springs. In fact, in one particular situation, they built a water line that was 5 miles long into one of the stations along this route. On the western side, here near Lucin, you can still see a massive rock quarry that was carved into the mountains. It provided limestone for the culverts, the stream channels, and rail line grade construction. And you can see it pictured here. I'm going to drive by it right now so you can catch that imagery just up the road here from me for a minute here. Now, Lucin was a happening place throughout about 1930. But after World War II, trains shifted from steam to diesel power, so the need for small water and maintenance stations disappeared, and so did the steam engines. Lucin was eventually abandoned, but modern trains still make their way across a new line that stretches across the Great Salt Lake and continues across Nevada. It's an incredibly long and straight line. Now, the competing railroads coming from the east and the west relied heavily on the Chinese labor force of 1869. These Chinese workers replaced many of the Americans and European immigrants because the labor bosses found the latter, the Chinese, to be less reliable than the Asian workers. In fact, many of the white laborers abandoned the physical labor of the railroad in pursuit of fortune through the California gold rush. Now, with the difficulties the railroads were facing in finding hard workers who were willing to do this backbreaking work, the work fell upon this growing Asian population. In a year's time, a small group of Chinese workers grew to an estimated 20,000 laborers here, just in this area. China was engulfed in a civil war at the time, and many Chinese families were fleeing the war, famine, and a corrupt government. Historians believe that in the 1840 to 1850 range, about 20 million Chinese were killed in a violent rebellion in China, with another 30 million forced to flee their homes and look for opportunity elsewhere in the world. California Governor Leland Stanford stated that without the Chinese, it would have been impossible to complete the western portion of the National Railroad. He described the Chinese as a systematic, competent, wonderfully effective workforce who were tireless and unremitting in their industry. Well, the Chinese each received wages of a whopping $30 to $35 a month. They were divided into these groups of about 30 men per work party. Each group selected a leader who received all of the wages for the entire group and bought provisions. Every night before bed, the Chinese workers enjoyed hot baths in powder kegs. So they actually had a pretty nice life out here in the middle of nowhere, but it wasn't like the white people had in that area as well. For nearly 73 years, the Union Pacific and the Southern Pacific Railroads employed hundreds of workers to maintain the various places along the Transcontinental Railroad. These various pieces of stations, 365 days a year. You know, one small dip in a rail, a bent rail, a blown out culvert, or any number of other issues could have spelled doom for a fully loaded passenger or freight train. But by 1942, the rail line that was painstakingly built was torn down, and the track line was preserved by the United States Bureau of Land Management as a protected 400-foot wide, 90-mile long piece of American history right down this roadway. And I'm really grateful they did that. You know, and this is a great time to stop and look at one of the remaining trestles that exist along the transcontinental line, a testament to what was built more than 150 years ago. And then the next stop that we're going to make as we look at this video of the trestle is the small community of Bovine, the first ghost town that we're going to stop in. It's a place today that's nothing more than sagebrush habitat. However, from the 1870s through 1910, Bovine was a maintenance station for the Transcontinental Railroad. These small stations were spaced about 5 to 8 miles apart, and they housed workers whose sole purpose was to maintain the railroad, and the crew, which was usually about 15 people, lived in little wood-framed bunkhouses. Now, in many cases, like I was talking about earlier, there was segregation. So there were little Chinatowns built in all of these areas that kept the Chinese workers away from the American white workers. Isn't that strange? And yet so much like it is today still. And what a lost opportunity to understand each other's cultures better. But these stations usually had a wood freight platform, a water tank, and coal bins. The workers only had one day off per week, and weather was never a consideration of whether you were going to show up to work or not. So as we continue our journey, we're here in Bovine. Bovine was named because of the cattle operation that was going on here. And again, it was just one of those stops where they loaded cattle and they would get water if available from the area. It says track laying crews reached Bovine in March of 1869 and established a section station. And this place included actually a section house, a train car body, a Chinese bunk, and a cookhouse and a water tank. The site has been kind of looted, but if you look over here, you can see some of the old artifacts from the area. So from an archaeological standpoint, it's pretty dang cool. because you can actually see where there were buildings in the area. The next place we stop is a place called Terrace. And as we continue our trek eastward, again, we're going to be going down this road. We're going to stop at Terrace and Old Terrace. And this is an incredible place that I'm going to pull out my drone to give you a rare view of the large roundhouse that was built here. Now, you might need your imagination a little bit because the physical structure is gone, but the scars that it left on the landscape clearly show where the large pivot wheel that was used to turn those massive trains around 180 degrees so that they could come in, drop off their goods, make that 180 turn on that roundhouse, and then head back to San Francisco. If you were visiting in 1870, you would hear a bustling community of nearly 1,000 people in this desolate spot that we're looking at, speaking at least a dozen different languages. There would be boisterous and rowdy saloons, the sound of an opera house actually out here. Can you imagine that? Rumbling and screeching steam trains, and the neighs of horses, screaming and laughing children at play, and all other noises produced by a prospering town. It would have been a magical place out here in this desert. Now, Terrace supported the third largest Chinatown in all of Utah's territory, and it was a gateway to the silver and gold mining booms in the mountains to the west. The town was so large because this was the place where the steam engines were stored while they were cooled down, cleaned, painted, and flushed. They actually flushed the system out before they would get them started up again. In Terrace, the Central Pacific Railroad built a wood and brick roundhouse to put trains into, and nearly 100-foot wide wooden turntable that would rotate an entire steam engine and tender. This is the area where the coal or wood for the boiler was held, and get it facing back the direction it came from. These maintenance facilities required hundreds of railroad workers who ranged from engineers working on the mechanical components of steam boilers to the laborers who climbed into the steam engines to remove debris and coal waste, the things they would get out of those boilers. They all lived in the Terrace, and many of them brought their families with them. Almost overnight, the town exploded into one of the largest settlements in the most remote area of northwestern Utah. It's hard to imagine as you sit out here and think about what was out here at the time, but the Terrace had 2 hotels and at least a dozen saloons and restaurants. There were dry goods stores for supplies and food, a 2-story train depot, wood-framed houses on the north side of town, and even a school, a library, and a garden park. And like I mentioned earlier, those folks were on the north side, but on the south side of town was an established, bustling community of Chinese. They were culturally, economically, and physically separated from the white areas of town, yet they were thriving on their own. By 1900, the Terrace was on the decline, and the Southern Pacific Railroad decided to build the Loosen Cutoff, which is actually over here. And with the Loosen Cutoff, the town's future was sealed. One of the town's only physical reminders of the town's existence is found in an old cemetery and a few archaeological artifacts, and you can see those in this imagery here. Well, I decided that I'd drive along this road at the pace of a 19th century steam engine, 18 miles per hour. You know, it seemed excruciatingly slow to me, but imagine those passengers who were riding inside in relative comfort compared to the slow pace they would have traveled by horse or wagon. And keep in mind that the landscape has changed very little from what it looked like in 1869 out here. To many of the travelers on the Transcontinental Railroad, Utah's landscape was foreign and seemingly desolate. Listen to this excerpt from an 1872 traveler's guide for the railroad that describes the exact vista that you're looking at and seeing now. It said, "The Great American Desert, which extends over an area of about 60 miles square. A vast extent where the eye wanders in vain for some green object, some evidence that in times gone by this waste supported animal life or will eventually in years to come support life. All is desolate in the extreme. The bare beds of alkali or the wastes of gray sand alone meet the vision. If we accept now and then a rocky hill more barren than the plains, if such a thing were possible. Evidently, this desert was once the bed of a saline lake, perhaps a portion of the Great Salt Lake itself. The sloping plain sweeps off toward that body of water and in places bends down until its thirsty sands are laved by the briny flood. Close quote. While the desert seems desolate, I learned over my lifetime that it is filled with wildlife and in some places water. So let's check out a few areas where I think we're going to see some hawks, some rabbits, who knows, maybe even some antelope. Well, our next stop is going to be the ghost town of Matlin. Now, this might seem like just another small section on the map, but in reality, Matlin was an important part of the entire Transcontinental Railroad operation. Trains were traveling in both directions along this section of railroad, and Matlin became a haven because it was one of those places where a set of parallel tracks were laid, allowing trains to actually move off the primary track long enough for an oncoming train to pass. Matlin was a siding, and these sidings were strategic places every 10 to 20 miles. Matlin had an impressive 300-foot long siding, which meant for 300 foot of rail off to each side, you could pass trains. Matlin was really important because it also was near a section of the mountains and the hills, which created a really difficult passage point for steam engines. Think about it, they're pulling these incredibly heavy freight cars. So to solve the problem, the railroad supplied helper engines to come out, hook onto those trains, and pull those up through those tough areas. One place, Bay, those helper trains, would pull the trains up and over the steep mountain passes. And to show you how advanced Matlin was, it also had a Y. That's spelled W-Y-E. The Y is a two-angled line of track that creates what looks like a triangular junction, kind of like a highway on and off ramp. This allowed the helper engine to turn around without the need of a turntable, like those found at the terrace that we looked at. Now I want to stop along our journey here to share one of the byway's still functioning stone culverts. You can see the stone culvert and how it's kind of tucked into some sagebrush below the rail bed. Finding the culverts is actually quite easy if you read the landscape to see where water would have flowed during a rainstorm, perhaps still flows during a rainstorm. When it rains in this part of the country, flash floods frequently occur, especially in the spring and summer when big thunderstorms dump massive amounts of water onto this dry desert. So to prevent the damage to the railroad, the Central and Union Pacific engineers needed to design structures to keep water flowing safely underneath and away from the rail bed. Careful thought was put into the engineering of the tracks over these washes and streams and along wetlands. But remember, most of these that we're looking at are original, making them more than 150 years old. Today, most culverts are made of metal, but back in the 19th century and during the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad here in Utah, steel wasn't readily available. So builders commonly found natural resources, including locally quarried limestone, for those culverts to be constructed. They were simple in design and in material, yet they have allowed free flow of water under those rail beds for almost 200 years. It's pretty darn remarkable. Now, the Bureau of Land Management has indicated that there are at least 30 original stone culverts remaining along the railroad grade that we have been riding along. So if you ever make it out here, pay close attention to the stones in the culvert and how they change from the west end near Lucin to the eastern end near the Golden Spike National Historic Park. You see, closer to Lucin, the stone is a grayish limestone that was quarried in the hills above the towns. Halfway across the desert, the culverts switch to black basalt, which you can see in that region. And then when we get back to the Petland Cut, the stone reverts back to the limestone. So it's really cool how it takes advantage of the geography as well. These culverts are amazing feats of human ingenuity, and they kept these passenger and freight trains safe from floods. I mean, think about this. Each heavy stone was lifted into place by hand or by a horse and arranged that way to maximize the construction strength. And frankly, that strength is evident by the fact that they've remained standing for more than 150 years. Now, the next place we're stopping is Romola, built in 1899 to meet the increased rail traffic and the need for local ranchers to be able to get their cattle to market. Here we can see an example of a single stringer trestle with large wooden wings. Many of these bridges were laid on simple timber sills, and the subsequent work of piling was carried out by those Chinese section gangs who dug deep holes for the wooden foundation's poles. The pilings were supported by riprap, that's rocks, boulders, used boiler bricks, and other kinds of trash. Now we're going to continue down this rail grade. Again, this is the original 1869 rail grade to Ombe. Ombe was established to complement the Y at Matlin. Remember the Y. The construction crews had to cut this area out through a mountain pass and make it wide enough to support a full parallel track or siding side by side, allowing trains to pass each other. When the weather was bad, trains were pulled into this cut for protection. And for decades, Ombe's section crews rotated trains and shifted rails up to 7 times a day, at peak times during the 1870s. This photo shows the Y in Ombe, towering above the surrounding sagebrush. And as you drive through Ombe, look for it on the south side of the road, west of the cut. And what would a Profiling Evil video be without a mention of crime and criminals as part of Twisted Tales? You see, in 1890, a pair of criminals broke into a section house in Bovine. That's about 20 miles west. We've already passed Bovine. The constable from Terrace chased the robbers and captured them just outside of Ombe. The 2 men were arrested, and they were tried in Ombe by Justice William Murphy, who took them into custody. Confused with train times, the constable decided to put the prisoners on a railroad handcar with a section foreman as his backup and started east toward the tracks toward Ogden. Now remember, a handcar, they're pumping that thing. As they're going down the track, suddenly a train appears around the far end of the Ombe cut. And with no time to spare, all the men had to jump from the handcar onto the side of the tracks. The handcart was demolished, and in the melee that ensued, the constable's gun went off and the bullet struck the constable in his own hip. He shot himself. He fell to the ground badly injured. The prisoners saw the opportunity to escape, but before they could do so, the section foreman, the guy that was helping, grabbed the constable's gun and held him at gunpoint until help arrived. There, they all waited until the next eastbound train came along, where they hitched a ride to the jail in Ogden and medical care for that constable. Now, the next place we stop at is Peplin. Peplin was named after the Peplin Mountain, this really steep and imposing rock barrier that created a real barrier to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. During the construction, engineers decided that the most efficient route for the railroad to take was to cut right through the rock and continue eastward toward Kelton. The workers would have to chip away at the 300-foot-long rock barrier inch by inch. They didn't cut through the rock like they were building a tunnel through it. Instead, they started at the top and they cut downward, just like you would if you were removing the layers of an onion. The process took several weeks, and if you're visiting this location, look for the large piles of rocks on both sides of the cut. Those are the same rocks. And after the railroad was completed, small rocks along the sides of the cut were frequently dislodged, falling onto the railroad tracks. So local crews had to get off and clean the debris off of the tracks several times a day. The Bureau of Land Management has restricted travel through this particular section because of the rock that's falling still today. So we have to follow kind of a goofy detour around that and make our way back up. But if you really want to see it up close, just hike into the cut and make sure you watch out for wildlife and take plenty of water. And remember, it could be 20 degrees outside or 110. It just is so wild out here in the Utah desert. Now, the next place we're going to talk about is Zias, or Zias, and I'm not sure which way you say that. There's not a lot recorded about Zias. A single track siding exists there that may have served area ranchers. The interesting thing about this location is it appears that it was used for a dumping site of trash based on that little dump site that's located there. So it's a great place to go out and look around and dig around and see if you can find something cool. Who knows? But now one of my favorite towns along the Transcontinental Railroad is the little community of Kelton. Probably one of the most important towns in northern Utah during the 1870s and 1880s. It's remembered as the home to one of the most robbed stagecoaches and freight wagon lines in American history. Every single day it seemed like that stage was getting robbed there. Kelton served as a critical stop for people and supplies, and until the railroad was complete, it was a major thoroughfare for wagon trains who were heading to the mining camps up in Idaho to the north and as far away as California to the west. Now, during any given year in the 1870s, more than 6 million pounds of dry goods, mining supplies, canned food, and beverages traveled through this area on wagons pulled by horse, mule, or oxen. This is why it was the most robbed place on the planet, I believe. Once the train line was complete, much of this transferred to the rail cars. But with each load going out to the camps, gold dust, bullion, furs, and wool were being shipped back to Kelton to be loaded onto trains heading west and heading out for bigger markets. All of this hustle and bustle meant that millions of dollars of supplies, cash, and gold traveled through some of the most unpopulated areas of the Intermountain West, and it was certainly a temptation for robbers, and rob they did. One of my favorite stories of the area is the daring stage robbery, and it comes from the Ogden Daily Herald newspaper in 1870. It says, quote, "Come down." And he did come down very meekly, and he took the position assigned him. This imperative command was given to the driver by one of the masked robbers who stopped the incoming stagecoach last night when the vehicle was within 8 miles of Kelton, Utah. There were 8 passengers on board the coach. One of the robbers went to the head of the team and took possession of the lead horses. The other 3 went through the travelers, some of whom were ladies, and disposed them of all their money and their other valuables, which occupied about 2 hours and a half. The daring thieves got about $2,500 in cash, 4 watches, and other jewelry. The avaricious, pernicious wretches even took from the persons of their passengers their shirt studs and their buttons. They then broke open the traveling trunks and took from them whatever was sufficient of value or convenient to get off with. After the rascals had plundered the people of all they could, they took off the leaders from the team, unharnessed them, and struck out with them for some place of safe retreat. We understand they did not interfere with any of Uncle Sam's mail bags because they had not the time to go through them. But before they left, They returned the watch they took from the stage driver and gave each of the travelers $1 to buy supper when they reached Kelton. Close quote. Well, it's estimated that over 300 people called Kelton home during this time, but when the train line shifted, Kelton slowly began to die. As Kelton and its residents entered the Great Depression of the 1930s, there was little hope for the struggling little community, and most of Kelton's residents packed up and left for better opportunities in other parts of the country. By the time World War II happened, Kelton was a ghost town. Today, Kelton Cemetery is the most prominent feature remaining, and a stop here is well worth the walk through. There are many more people buried here than there are markers, which have deteriorated over the years. But this is a must-see for crime enthusiasts who won't ever forget the most robbed town in the Wild West. Our next stop is Eleanor, which was largely inhabited, although it had a really long siding, which measured 2,300 feet in length. Now, that said, it undoubtedly had a small team of people living there and working there, but Eleanor may have been used as a freight outlet. There's really not any records to say for sure, but the site remained operational until about 1902 to 1907 before it went completely out of business and became a ghost town. The next place, the section station at Seco, was established in 1873 to accommodate station facilities that were moved from 10 Mile, another section station 3.5 miles further east. The work crews and the inhabitants of Seco were mainly Chinese, and there aren't many official records for the area. In fact, I don't think there are any official records for the area, but it's believed that about 25 people lived here. Some of the Chinese section gangs undoubtedly carried out maintenance work and improvements here in order to keep up with the erosion and deterioration that goes along with the West Desert. For many years, you could find historic artifacts out here, things like broken pottery, for instance, but sadly, many people have taken these things. I'm not sure, but I would suspect that that is now protected along a site like this since the Bureau of Land Management oversees it. The Central Pacific Railroad records indicate that Seco was not a formal station due to the lack of nearby water. Eventually, the railroad did build a small section house here and a bunkhouse which remained operational until 1901. Technology had improved the steam engine immensely, and smaller stations were needed, and less frequent stops were required along the Transcontinental Railroad. Welcome to the famous 10-mile section. On April 28, 1869, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroad Company set a world record for railroad construction that still stands today. Railroad companies were paid by the mile of construction that they accomplished, and the competition was great between the Central and the Union Pacific lines. Construction reached a fevered pitch in 1869 when Vice President Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific Railroad Company bet President Charles Crocker of the Central Pacific Railroad Company $10,000 that they couldn't beat the Union Pacific's railroad of 7.5 miles of rail built in one day. Well, Crocker and his construction superintendent, J.H. Stonebridge, took the bet, and they wagered that they could build 10 miles in one day. So on April 27, 1869, Crocker and Stonebridge organized 4,000 men and hundreds of horses and wagons. Unfortunately, a steam engine carrying supplies derailed and their work was postponed until the next day. At 7 a.m. on the morning of April 28, 1869, the crews started laying track. By 7 p.m. that evening, 12 hours after starting, the Central Pacific crews completed 10 miles and 56 feet of new track, thereby winning the wager and setting a new world record. This amazing feat has never been matched again, and likely never will be equaled without the aid of new technology rather than the brute force of men Well, I was really looking forward to stopping at Monument Point. It's really hard to imagine that as the Transcontinental Railroad construction crews were passing the Monument Point in April of '69, that this large rock monolith was completely surrounded by the waters of the Great Salt Lake. A traveler's guide from 1885 describes the scene, saying, quote, "When the strong south wind blows, the waves dashing against the rocks on the shore and the rolling white caps in the distance form a beautiful view, which the tourist, after passing the dreary waste, will appreciate." Close quote. Well, let's fly the drone around this area for a moment as we talk about it. This is the site of one of the first salt recovery operations in the state of Utah. Formed in the early 1870s, the Desert Salt Works Company built a small operation here on the bed of the lake. The plan? Harvest the evaporated salt for use in food and other industrial applications. The company even built a few workhouses, but it all fell apart by the 1880s. But while you're here, I want you to look around to the east of the Monument Point where you can still see remnants of the western edge of the Union Pacific grade line that was constructed before the United States Congress selected the Golden Spike Monument for the final meeting place. They thought it was going to be here. I hope you're enjoying this scenery, as even though it's quite barren. Now, I want to make one more stop before we reach the Golden Spike Monument. We're going to stop at Cosmo. Like so many of the small section stations along the Transcontinental Railroad, nobody truly knows where the name Cosmo came from. Does that remind you of a Seinfeld episode? Cosmo was constructed around 1900 and was primarily used by sheep and cattle ranchers for shipping. Cosmo had two sidings, remember, tracks alongside each other, that were separated by 1 mile. In 1919, Cosmo was getting a lot of attention with the discovery of potash in the area. Potash is a mineral salt, rich in potassium, that's used primarily in fertilizer today. In the early 1900s, though, it was used as the main ingredient in gunpowder. Over 200 people lived in the growing little town, but it all ended before 1930 when the potash market declined. The mines were closed, and everyone except the railroad maintenance crews left the area. And in this same area was the place where both railroads actually met. As surprising as it sounds, neither Congress nor President Lincoln located the spot for the two companies to bring the Transcontinental Railroad together. This created both a problem and an opportunity, as the railroad companies were each paid for every mile of track that they laid. Each railroad was trying to lay as much rail as it possibly could to make more money, even if they didn't line up with each other. For nearly 40 miles, crews from each railroad company were building parallel grades, heading in opposite directions. In some cases, the crews were within feet of each other during their blasting and filling efforts. Then, Congress finally decided that the meeting point for the two railroads would be an east slope of what is now known as the Golden Spike National Historic Park. On May 10, 1869, with robust speeches and a symbolic driving of a gold, silver, and copper spike, America's great engineering marvel, the Transcontinental Railroad, was complete. And in one final interesting twist here on Twisted Tales is this reality. The passenger and freight train operations along the railroad had to wait another 3 months before they started using the Transcontinental line. Poor quality work, a result of building the railroad lines too quickly, trying to get the money, demanded repairs and adjustments in order to ensure safety. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this trip across the Transcontinental Railroad line, a historic 90-mile landmark across Utah's northern desert. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this trip across the Transcontinental Railroad line, a historic 90-mile landmark across Utah's northern desert. I hope that you'll visit the area and make the journey yourself. But please, Make sure that you've got a four-wheel drive vehicle with a backup tire. Fill up on snacks and bring plenty of water. And make sure that you're telling someone that you're traveling the route. If they don't hear from you in a certain amount of time, have them call the authorities to come out and help you get home. Hey, thanks for tuning into this special Profiling Evil edition of Twisted Tales and this journey across the Utah desert along the Transcontinental Railroad grade of 1869. Please check out Profiling Evil on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you like audio podcasts, folks, please check out Profiling Evil's audio podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. Now, if you like this video, please consider donating through our website at profilingevil.com. And please hit the like and subscribe button, ring the bell, share us with your friends, and give us a thumbs up. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.